First of all, there is a quiz this week. There is going to be 5 questions, just 5 multiple choice questions. If you've been keeping up with the reading and the lectures, you should do fine. Nothing that we're doing here today will be on that test, but it is due Friday by midnight. You should have gotten an email from me and a notification in Learn.
It was actually 2 because I somehow screwed it up and there's 2 notifications.
Yeah, well, I mean, more notifications the better, right?
So it's not 2 tests, it's just 2 notifications.
So they're just 5 multiple choice questions. Should be pretty easy. You can get it done in a couple of minutes. It's just to gauge how far you guys are coming along on this stuff and how well you all are paying attention. Because, I can see the views on YouTube. I can't hit that enough. I can see how many people are actually watching the lectures. So, where we left off last time, we were talking about Bacon's Rebellion and the weird and wonky way that they kind of went around the issue of indentured servitude. Eventually, coming to have Virginia emphasize more of slavery rather than indenture, because they don't want to have those kinds of rebellions. They'll find out there's plenty of other rebellions when it comes to slavery as well, so it doesn't exactly help them. But in the meantime, this is a turning point where slavery became more prevalent in the southern colonies than in the north, and when indentured servitude started to wane. So, by the time this is done, we have a fairly clear economy developing in the colonies. Right around 1700, in the north, there was mercantilism building up as the northern colonies, especially New England and especially Boston by itself, instead of focusing so much on religious liberty and all that kind of stuff, they had come together, fell apart, been put under a dominion, seen the carnage wrought by witch trials and all that kind of stuff. And so they started becoming more secular. And as a result, Boston became the shipbuilding capital of the English colonies. This meant that much of the New World trade was dominated by New Englanders. And this came to be called the Triangle Trade. So the middle colonies, instead of focusing on the actual trading part of it, focused on financing it. This is when New York started to become the financial capital of what would eventually become the United States. So you have middle colonies financing, you have New England doing the actual trading. Can you guess what the southern colonies are doing? Remember, they switched to slaves, so why do they need so many slaves? Agriculture, but a specific kind of agriculture. Cash crops. Because in the north, there's actually more farmers than there are in the south. But, actually that's true even today. But the difference being, these are small plots of land creating food stuffs. Whereas in the south, they're creating cash crops. So they're reliant on slaves to produce these large plantations, starting in Virginia with tobacco, but you started seeing in like South Carolina a lot of rice, and soon the buildup of a type of crop that would come to dominate the slave trade, cotton. Now, at first, cotton is incredibly labor intensive, to the point that it doesn't even make sense to use slaves to manufacture it, because you have two different types of cotton. You have short seed cotton and long seed cotton. Long seed cotton could use these gins that they've been using over in India for centuries. Right around, I think 500 AD is when the Indian gin was created. But it wasn't efficient enough to be used on short seed cotton, which grew best in the American South. So at this point in 1700, the main crops are tobacco and rice. They're also making sugar cane, but that's mostly in places that are not English colonies yet, or in Jamaica, which we're not really talking about here. Sugar cane was actually by far the most labor intensive and tended to kill off the slaves really quickly. And remember, these people view slaves as just a type of property, another type of labor, so they can work them to death and, feel no compunction. The price of a slave during the, we only have data for after the American Revolution, but roughly after the American Revolution, all the way until the 1850s, the price of a slave was about half of what it would cost you to buy an iPhone today. So it was way cheaper to buy a slave than even, most of you have phones in your pockets. So it was a labor system that perpetuated itself. Remember, we were talking about importing slaves. So they're coming from Africa without speaking the language, taken far away from home. They have really no recourse. They either labor or they try to escape, and even escape doesn't really do much for them because they are in a strange land. So you have New England controlling the actual trade, you have the middle colonies creating capital, and you have the southern colonies creating the raw goods. This is all part of a cycle that once they got manufactured all that stuff and got it ready to ship, it went to England or somewhere in Europe where they could use that raw material and turn it into manufactured goods. In turn, some of those manufactured goods were really good for trading down in Africa for slaves. This is the triangle trade, that you have raw material in the Americas, manufacturing in Europe, and slaves in Africa. That's the triangle. Though it varied, because sometimes, especially later once New England became more and more of a manufacturing center, oftentimes it would be New England doing the manufacturing, and so the triangle changed. But primarily, you have, sugar, which would be turned into rum for long distances. You had cotton in the long seed form, and rice and tobacco being sent over to Europe. Europe would turn that into, cigarettes. Use the rum for any number of industrial purposes. And although industrial is not really a good term for it, but manufacturing purposes. And all those kinds of things help feed Europe and create it as more and more of a power in the world. The triangle trade of the Atlantic is basically what made Europe the predominant world power. So no one is innocent of slavery. No one is, it's not just a Southern problem. New England is the one transporting these people. And you can see here in this picture, this is a diagram of how they would transport. This is a cargo map. Now, cargo being human cargo. And you can see these people are packed in there. A massive amount of people were fit into these ships' hulls. Because, once again, it's really cheap to actually buy slaves. Africa is getting manufactured goods, often guns, which the kingdoms that had that gun trade for slaves would use those guns to go out and start new wars, get new war captives. They turn those war captives into slaves, and you can see how the cycle perpetuates itself. This is especially bad in the Caribbean because in the Caribbean there's a lot more slaves going there, and eventually the largest amount of slaves would actually go to Brazil. The southern colonies are just a small part of this slave trade, but New England dominates it. So you have, with that crossing, you have a huge amount of people who packed into these holes. So can you guess what's happening when they're being exposed to European diseases, or Europeans being exposed to their diseases, actually? And can you guess what's happening in these hulls when they're packed in so tight? They're dying en masse, yes. It was once estimated that the reason why the great white shark made it all the way across the Atlantic was because of the number of slaves dumped off the back of ships. That's been drawn into doubt recently, but you can guess the sheer amount of death that is built into this system to cause that. So, of course, can you guess what slaves would do on a regular basis as a result of these horrid conditions? No, there was actually plenty of that, and interestingly enough, we actually have the manifests of a lot of these voyages, so you can know exactly how many people committed suicide. And how do you commit suicide while sailing on a ship? You just jump off. Easy as that, right? But even more so were slave revolts. It got to the point that it was so common that slave ships had to build barricades, because obviously they had to move them to feed them and all that kind of stuff. They'd bring them up to the top decks so that they can get sun and all that kind of stuff. But moving those people around who, are in chains probably don't like that so much. They also don't like the conditions below decks. So it makes a lot of sense that they would try to stop these conditions by taking over. It's estimated that there were at least 200 shipboard slave revolts in the transatlantic trade, also known as the Middle Passage. In fact, you will be reading an account of one such, not really a revolt, but of the passage itself, a first-person account. And you can see in that person's tale the conditions were terrible. Roughly 12.5 million slaves were transported during the Atlantic slave trade. About 14.5% of them dying along the way. So we're talking a death toll in the millions. But of course, most of them were not bound for what would eventually become the United States. This is also the start of mercantilism. Remember how that New England had to switch from being very puritanical to allowing more and more capitalistic enterprise. Now, we wouldn't call this capitalism today, we would call it mercantilism. And mercantilism basically means that a country has high tariffs. That means that they tax any kind of incoming good from foreign countries except from their colonies. So you have several navigation acts requiring New Englanders to go straight to England rather than to any other place. There's a huge amount of smuggling anyways, because how was the British Empire going to stop that? But they are legally obligated to send all of their goods to England first. This is a sea change in the way that merchants had operated for, well, millennia, where they basically were their own operation, just moving as trading caravans or trading ships that just went from port to port or kingdom to kingdom and traded whatever they could. Instead here, it's a very clear system. You know, you have that triangle trade, and it's legally obligated to go that way. So mercantilism is kind of the foundation of capitalism. Whereas before, you wouldn't really have to deal with banking and all that kind of stuff to finance these kinds of major operations. Here, because it's such a clear system, you need a lot of capital investment. You need, big ships. You need big crews. If you have some sort of financial loss, you need insurance. Slaves were insured. So a lot of that 14% that died along the way could be recouped through insurance. And yes, there were people who were estimating the worth of lives back in England specifically to figure out how much of a cost was willing to be paid out for slaves who died along the Middle Passage. And remember, this is basically the foundation of capitalism, the system we live in today. But of course, England is just one part of this story. There's... Oh, my notes are backwards. Huh. Strange. All right. But there is New France and New Spain, and especially we're still talking about what will eventually become the United States. So in what is here, New Mexico, has its own major change going on as a part of this whole general crisis. Now, the Mexican Inquisition had been founded in 1571 in New Spain, and it was technically supposed to be rooting out heresy. So people were only subject to the Inquisition if they had converted. Of course, we're talking about the Spanish idea of conversion, not the native idea. Natives will often, supposedly convert simply so that they can get access to those manufactured goods. Remember that whole triangle trade. New Spain is still very much part of that triangle trade. And slavery was legal. In fact, slavery would be legal here in New Mexico all the way until 1867. It's actually after the war. after the Civil War that slavery was eliminated here. But it's a very, very different system because you have Apache and Navajo raiding pretty much as soon as the Spanish arrive and set up shop here in 1598. Throughout that time, they're dealing with these nomads to the east and west of the colony, and who are basically raiding the Spanish for sustenance. So they come in, take a few sheep, take a few cattle, and be on their merry way. Except for, of course, the Spanish didn't like that so much, so they started counter-raiding. And this turns quite a bit more violent, because when you start sending raiding parties to go and enslave a few Indians, then they come and enslave a few Spanish. And so on and so forth, until you have this entire system of violence perpetuating itself. And realize, yes, they are absolutely enslaving Indians. So, within this whole system of violence, the Puebloans here were basically Christianized, and they were what were called neophytes. Now you have to realize a lot of the records from this time are gone, and we'll get to why that is. So we're only able to piece the story through recollections. But a Puebloan named Pope was one of these supposedly converted people who were then subject to the Inquisition. Him and several other people were caught supposedly practicing witchcraft. And so, after having dealt with the Inquisition, who actually executed 2 of these people for witchcraft, by the way, but Pope survived and escaped. And mind you, when the Spanish execute somebody for witchcraft, it's actual burning at the stake. So up there in Santa Fe, they actually burnt people at the stake. You also have to understand, remember that whole Apache Navajo counter-raiding thing? Well, the governor's palace up there, it used to be festooned with human ears because that was a way of counting the number of dead that Spanish would cut off an ear and string it around. That's where you get that whole trope of ears on a string. That was a standard practice for collecting bounties and for simply saying how well the expedition did. And as these war trophies were brought back, they'd string them around the governor's palace. That's a decoration they're not going to be bringing back anytime soon. So, of course, Pope was a bit miffed by all of this, right? So, in 1680, he formulated a conspiracy amongst the Pueblos all met, a bunch of the leaders of the Pueblos met in Taos and formulated a plan to kick out the Spanish. He essentially gave them all a series of knotted ropes that said, we'll have this many days to when we will all rise up. And so they untied a knot every single day until they hit that last knot, and boom, there was a massive uprising of most of the Pueblos. Not all, though. For instance, Isleta actually gave refuge to the Spanish and migrated with them southward. That's why there's a pueblo in Texas called Isleta del Sur. They actually were fleeing from the Pueblo revolt. Remember that whole divide and conquer thing. This is key to conquest. It's dividing them, finding allies to help you maintain power, and then eventually even those allies get screwed over. But they won. The Puebloans pushed the Spanish Empire back all the way down to what is now called Ciudad Juarez, but at that point was called El Paso. The El Paso we know is on the other side of the river and wasn't actually founded yet. It was on the west side of the river that El Paso was at that point. And they lost at least 500 Spaniards. No, at least 400. Spaniards were killed in this uprising. So, huge victory for the Puebloans. Now, of course, we don't know what went on while the Puebloans had control of New Mexico. Supposedly, the Navajos and Apaches turned on them. They had actually helped in the uprising, and they, in turn, started raiding Puebloans. Pope clearly lost power very quickly. So, there were a number of raiding parties sent up from El Paso to try to quell the Pueblo revolt and gain back New Mexico. But most of these were just raiding parties. So they come riding up here, burn a pueblo or two, kill 50 or 100 Puebloans, and then come riding back. Remember, these are the Spaniards. They're not exactly nice when it comes to conquest, especially when they're losing. So it's not until 1692 that Diego de Vargas led a reconquista that, remember, they'd already been raiding back and forth for 12 years by this point. And so he actually comes in unopposed, lands in Santa Fe, and most of the Puebloans pledged loyalty to the Spanish Empire. But he was actually just there to raid, not expecting to conquer. So in 1693, he returns with an actual batch of settlers, and of course, the Puebloans didn't actually believe in those pledges of loyalty. By the way, one thing to keep in mind is the reason why the Puebloans could organize this massive revolt was because they spoke Spanish. The Spanish language unified them against the Spanish. So they were, when they said that they got pledges of loyalty, they could speak the language. But, as we've seen numerous times, it's probably not a good idea to pledge loyalty to an empire, because it's going to screw you over eventually. But this Pueblo revolt was put down rather handily, killing around only 12 people. But there was another even bigger revolt that killed a few dozen. Either way, 1693, New Mexico is permanently settled by the Spanish. And because of the Inquisition's role in all this, at least in New Mexico, the Inquisition is no longer allowed to cover Indians. So, no more popes. So, there's a bit of secularization going on in New Mexico as well as a result of all this. And New France doesn't really change all that much during all this, but they do create a stronger, more centralized system. Um, the fur trade, of course, continues throughout this period, but the fact is they have forts deeper and deeper into Le Pays d'Ajo and Illinois and New Orleans area or Louisiana area, and all the way up and down the St. Lawrence River and all the way around the Great Lakes. In fact, they have trading posts all the way up to the Rockies. So by 1700, it's a pretty robust system, but it's just trading. It's not settlement. Unlike New Spain and England, where they have these centers of power, France is starting to really lag behind. Spain's getting its butt whipped in New Mexico, but they're still absolutely a power because they've got the rest of the New World, basically, save for Brazil. And the France wanted to compete, obviously. Remember that a lot of this is about monarchical rivalries. So they created a council to rule the entirety of New France. That's from Louisiana all the way up to the mouth of the St. Lawrence River in 1647. But it was just a council, and a lot of the time you'd have tribal leaders going to this council, which was centered in Montreal, to go and basically try to plead for more aid from the crown. This was under the direct purview of the French crown. But in 1663, that wasn't really working so well because there was so little settlement. And if they had to send one of the council back to France every time they wanted to make a major decision, that's a bit of a problem because one of the council being gone is a significant portion of the population. And so in 1663, the Sovereign Council was created, basically elevating New France to the level of a French commune. A French commune is basically what they call a province. There's a bunch of different administrative things that come with being a commune, but this was essentially making it a province of France. And along with it came the Custom of Paris, which was a standard law set forth for the entirety of the territory. Along with it, in 1666, 800 women were paid by King Louis XIV to go and settle in New France, basically trying to make a more settled colony so that there would be more entrenched power, because once you have a breeding population, it can self-sustain, right? But, of course, in that same year, they only found 3,215 people, French people, had settled in New France. That's tiny. Plus, throughout this period, you have the Beaver Wars going on. Remember, the Beaver Wars are nasty. You know, we're talking like, for instance, the Iroquois are trying to fight the Huron, and Hurons, while they were famous for like cutting French missionaries' fingers off and all that kind of stuff, they were considered much more humane than the Iroquois, who would often raid into Huron and into the Great Lakes region. And then when retaliatory raids were sent by those tribes, they would take their captives and nail them to trees so that they could so that the oncoming raiders had to pass their babies, their wives, or whatever, as they're going in to try to take revenge. It's a hell of a psychological tactic, and that's why the Iroquois became so powerful so quickly. They basically wiped the Huron off the map. This was pretty much genocide. And New France has to navigate this. They have to make alliances, and while they favored the Huron for a while in there, Huron started losing. So it's in France's best interest to try to create peace. So a guy named Louis de Bade de Frontenac started to fortify the Illinois region, especially the Pays de Hauts, which is basically the Ohio Valley, by making these kinds of alliances, which cemented what was called the All-Father system. Essentially, it meant that these tribes would pay homage to whoever was the governor of New France, and so they'd send their tribal leader to go and pay homage to them. But that also meant that the All-Father, the governor of France, had to navigate these treaties and basically would serve as arbiter. You can see here one such All-Father, the Frontenac guy, would participate in major ceremonies and everything along those lines. So this is what's called the middle ground, where France, while still trying to have authority in the region, doesn't have enough people to maintain military power, so they have to make alliances. But these alliances make a very enmeshed system where it's not really that the All-Father could control everything. He has to negotiate just as much as the tribes do. So it's a very unique system in the fact that the French Empire wasn't so much of an empire and just a series of negotiations. So in 1701, Iroquois, Algonquins, and Hurons, the Hurons that remained, there weren't many, swore peace in Montreal, leaving only alliances with France or Britain as means of maintaining, how they would, who would be more powerful. Basically, the entire region either had to be aligned with France or with England. And remember, there's an ancient rivalry there. So by 1701, the entirety of Indian territory from the reaches of Newfoundland all the way down to the mouth of the Mississippi River have to be aligned, because this entire system has centralized authority. But the problem is, all three of these empires, Spain, England, and France, have troubles back home to deal with. And this resulted in Queen Anne's War. So the Spanish and French had already had missionaries all the way deep into the frontier, and so those were often manned also with military forces. But this also meant that Spain was starting to butt up against the southern colonies, which meant that that the Carolinas needed to centralize authority to deal with possible Spanish incursions. So they split the Carolinas in 1691, actually basically because of a dispute in governorship. Basically, there was a question as to who was the proper governor, and so they split it. But it wasn't officially split until 1712. But basically, they functioned as two separate colonies from then on. But what really brought this all to a head was in 1701, Louis XIV, who was basically the most powerful man in the world. He had by far the most powerful army and navy. So France is basically king of the world, right? Spain's ruler died, and he was able to appoint his grandson as Philip V to become Spain's new monarch. But because of that whole balance of power, can you guess what Spanish vassals and England thought of this? They didn't like it, right? So they formed what's called the Grand Alliance. And which mainly was the Holy Roman Empire and England, to try to fight and appoint a different king of Spain. This war rages from 1701 to 1714, has various phases. We don't need to get into the specifics of the European War. But it ends up coming to the New World. So, for instance, since Spain was technically aligned with France, South Carolina used this as a time to go raiding into Florida. And that started almost immediately because the Spanish has been pushing into what is now Georgia for a while. And in fact, in 1704, one of the raids ends up killing over 200 Spanish-aligned Indians as part of this war. In 1707, there's the siege of Pensacola. In 1709, there's the siege of Mobile. You can see that there's just series of sieges of Spanish-held territory. And as a result of this war, Georgia would be ceded to Britain. In the north, where you have actual New France abutting English lands, you have New England trying to push into New France. Especially on the island, what are called the Sea Islands today, Newfoundland and all that area. There was a powerful batch of tribes called the Wabanaki Confederacy. And they aligned with France to try to push basically what is Maine today all the way to the sea. And this resulted in several massacres, especially the Deerfield Massacre, which killed 56 Englishmen and took more than 100 prisoner, many of them being enslaved. So of course, the English start resorting to guerrilla warfare just the same, and end up pushing so hard that they managed to take Port Royal in 1710, making the entirety of Acadia English territory. There will be a series of wars because of English control of Acadia that eventually will result in the 1760s expulsion of Acadians from this area, specifically saying you're not allowed to live here anymore. And that turns really nasty, but that's Canadian history. Eventually the war in Europe is settled with the Treaty of Utrecht. Utrecht is kind of seen as this. It's called the Peace of Utrecht. That is basically seen as a time of peace in Europe, because it settled a lot of these colonial rivalries, but only for like 20 years. But it doesn't really result in peace in the New World. So because of the fighting, there's in North Carolina, there was the Tuscarora who started raiding into the colony, and that war didn't really end until 1715. In South Carolina, just as that war was ending, the Yamasee started trying to doing that standard push the colonists to the sea. South Carolina had hundreds of colonists killed, unknown number, because of just how many people were killed by this. But, of course, didn't work. They turned around, massacre way more. You see a pattern here? In 1722, the Wabanaki Confederacy tries to start raiding again. And, in fact, the New England, who has Acadia, has a governor by the name of the Massachusetts governor is William Dummer, so it's called Dummer's War. Managed to push the border northward to gain even more territory for New England, and by 1725, the French cede Maine completely to the English. And in 1732, because of all of this fighting that had gone on in the South, Georgia was finally created specifically as a military military colony. So this guy named James Oglethorpe was made military commander of it. It's basically a proprietary colony, but with the express purpose of maintaining a military, a standing military. So this actually became a penal colony, which is basically, people who were jailed for any number of reasons back in England would be sent to this colony to basically act as soldiers. Because it's specifically made as a barrier colony, kind of like how New Hampshire was started that way, they actually made slavery illegal in 1732. But in 1752, that was turned around to being a crown colony. They started making cash crops just like their neighbors, and of course instituted slavery. So with all of this, you can see kind of a pattern from where you have like religion becoming more, religious institutions becoming more secularized as a result of all the violence of, the wars of religion back in Europe, but also things like the Inquisition and the Salem witch trials and whatnot. All of that means that institutions started becoming more secularized. That's why we see the rise of mercantilism, the triangle trade, all that kind of stuff. And mercantilism was kind of the foundation of capitalism. So you can see how this is kind of a runaway effect. You have certain crises, wars of religion, crown rivalries, all that kind of stuff, resulting in also centralizing authority, which means these either like New England, where it became a little bit more autonomous, but still centralized in the fact that New Englanders worked together. You have proprietary colonies that basically answer to the king now, and of course crown colonies in the south. And in New Spain, even though they were being pushed back on their frontiers, soon they had to either take back authority with force, aka the Reconquista, or basically pull back some authority, like removing the Inquisition from being allowed to inquisite Indians. And France kind of remains the same throughout all this. But as you can see, it's a lot about kind of balancing the powers, trying to make these monarchical rivalries be much more of co-equals rather than having one more powerful than the other. In 1651, is during all the fighting back in Europe, specifically like during the English Civil War, this guy named Thomas Hobbes wrote what's called the Leviathan. And his idea was essentially what became the foundation of social contract theory, where a sovereign embodies the entirety of his people. So you can see here a king made up of people. This is actually the cover of the Leviathan from the time. It's the frontispiece. And so that's kind of the idea of the general crisis, is centralizing authority. And you can see that this pattern is playing out in America, but in a very different way than, like the sovereign having absolute control. So, my question to you guys is, how do you think that's going to change things? How do you think that matters today? So, why does this whole general crisis matter today? What did it do that matters to the ongoing story of America, of us?
It kind of like set into motion what was to come, like the Revolutionary War, by like introducing these ideas of like centralizing authority to like more of the colonies rather than Europe, and then trying to balance the powers of like, I don't know, trying to make everyone more equal rather than like having a monarchical ruler over these people.
I mean, the colonies now have like an identity, so like they kind of have a reason to, form together. I guess.
Yeah. So, one is autonomy, is what you're talking about, and the other is identity. Some would call that proto-nationalism. I take great issue with that, but you could argue that it's proto-nationalism. The main idea is that these colonies, while they are centralizing authority, they're more centralizing authority to themselves, right? Yeah. And that has long-reaching consequences, doesn't it? So the way that the general crisis affected the New World really really puts it on a specific trajectory, doesn't it? But what about like New Spain and New France? How do they factor into this? Why does the Salem witch trials have something to do with the Pueblo revolt? And realize they happened within a year of each other. How does the general crisis tie these disparate events together.
I mean, religion.
Religion? Absolutely, yeah. Because you have, Salem witch trials are about trying to maintain purity. Funny enough, it ends up doing exactly the opposite. You have the Inquisition trying to maintain purity in New Mexico. Funny enough, ends up doing exactly the opposite.
Salem witch trials took place like 12 years after the Pueblo Revolt. It was the Reconquista.
Reconquista, thank you. Yes, I was off. It is the Reconquista. But still, how does this general crisis tie everything together? You have religion, yeah. But why does the triangle trade of the Atlantic become part of this story? What is that centralizing? Well, mercantilism is the capitalism will basically not be a term coined until the 19th century and really refers to what will happen after the American Revolution. Because you'll have guys like Adam Smith who specifically write their books arguing against mercantilism because it still means a lot of control, right? It is requiring trade to flow in a particular direction. That direction is to the crown, right? But especially with things like the American Revolution, 1776 is our Declaration of Independence. Can you guess when Adam Smith wrote his book? 1776. So, quite of a overlap in time there, right? So capitalism is a thing on the horizon, but this is very much setting up for that change. You had your hand raised?
Yeah, I was just gonna say the economy is global now.
Yeah.
There's a
Globalization.
central goal kind of.
Because, we talked last week about the foundations of these colonies and everything, but they're still very much, at that point, they were still very much focused on just trying to stay around, trying to maintain a foothold, rather than make a bunch of money for Europe. Except for Spain. Spain pretty quickly started mining, but the other colonies, while they tried to find gold, completely failed. Jamestown went into that starvation time because they were trying to find gold rather than making cash crops. So this whole system comes about because now they have enough centralized authority to tie the old world to the new world and vice versa through that triangle trade. This is basically the thing that connects the globe for the first time. It's not Columbus sailing, it's the triangle trade. And because of Spain mining silver so much, for instance, China during this whole general crisis basically has a monetary collapse. They had paper money that was backed by silver, but guess what happens when you flood the market with silver? That paper money collapses. And so China, who were arguably the most powerful country in the world at this point, collapses under the weight of this financial panic. And soon, the Ming Empire that was there would be taken over by the Qing, who are foreigners. They're they're Mandarins. So this is a far-reaching system, right? It's global and has global consequences. China's the other side of the world, and yet they're having a financial collapse because of what Spain is doing in the New World. And that's basically the end of the Ming Empire. The last Chinese empire that was actually Chinese. So you have this global system. What is the... Do we have enough time? Oh yeah, we got plenty of time. What does the Peace of Utrecht mean for this? That whole Queen Anne's War, this War of Spanish Succession. Oh, by the way, I forgot to say, the result of the War of Spanish Succession is that Philip remains king, but can no longer that France cannot have hegemony over him by treaty. Basically, they squared the circle. So, what does that, these territorial changes, all that kind of stuff, what does that mean moving forward?
Could it mean that there could possibly territorial disputes, like trying to regain old land, but at the same time trying to maintain current land?
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. So there will be territorial disputes throughout this period, and we'll find that one of the biggest wars in European history ends up being started by George Washington here in the New World. Specifically over territorial disputes. That is next week. So you have that, but what does it mean like internally for the colonies? What does life look like for the colonists because of this general crisis?
I would say just like a weakening, because like they're constantly being sent to war over territory for someone that they don't really see as like a real leader, because they're not even there, they're in a whole other part of the world. I don't know, like a less centralized view of who is in charge.
Yeah, well, I mean, we talked about like the centralizing authority in the colonies, right? But what about like economically?
I mean, just producing for the crown, I guess.
They're producing for the crown, yeah. But what does that mean for themselves?
Would they get less because they're continentally like up there?
Well, sure, they're getting less, but they're getting something, aren't
I
they?
mean, they're self-interest, but they're still tied to the crown, so
Yeah.
they're not really reaping the benefits.
Yeah, they're getting huge benefits. Remember, New England is controlling the triangle trade. So these folks are getting rich. The New World becomes a way to make money, to make your name. Instead of it just being a venture of the crown, suddenly these folks who have centralized authority in the colonies rather than directly to the crown are starting to see themselves becoming rich enough to basically rival, the monarchs and aristocracy of old. This is them becoming rich, and this will have lasting effects, right? After all, who's the richest country in the world today? The U.S., right? It starts here. It was founded on that triangle trade, right? And that triangle trade was founded on secularization. You can see how it's this kind of like this buildup of power, right? But the question will ultimately become who's that power buildup going to. So I think we have about 10 minutes left. Anybody got any questions? No, then that's it. Have a good day.